A single mechanical failure on an unsealed dirt runway dictates the entire survival trajectory of a combat aircraft. On the night of December 8, 1943, according to the most commonly cited aircraft histories, the nose gear collapses during landing at Drysdale. Some Australian rec notes place the event on December 7th, so the safer record is the December 7th to 8th landing accident. The aircraft is a North American B-25D Mitchell carrying the United States Army Air Force's serial 41-30816. In its operational theater, it operates under the Netherlands East Indies Air Force serial N5-161, carrying the painted nickname Mississippi Dream. Contemporary recovery accounts identify it as a B-25D-20, while the B-25 History Project lists the same serial as a B-25D-15NC. Until the original aircraft record card is quoted directly, the block number should remain qualified rather than absolute. It is assigned to 18 Squadron, Netherlands East Indies Air Force, a Dutch and Australian medium bomber unit operating under Royal Australian Air Force Command far from established logistical hubs. The incident occurs at Drysdale Airfield, a remote staging base carved directly into the austere scrubland of the Kimberley region in Western Australia. The operational requirement dictates launching heavy multi-engine bombers from these rough forward strips to strike targets to the north. When the bomber touches down and the nose gear collapses, the forward section drops onto the dirt, and the landing roll drives the nose along the unsealed surface. Later aircraft history summaries describe heavy damage to the nose and forward section, but they do not preserve a frame-by-frame damage report. The safer reconstruction is that the forward fuselage is badly damaged. The aircraft cannot continue operating, and the crew evacuates without serious injury while the airframe is left near the runway. This grounding immediately forces a critical technical assessment. Number 4. Royal Australian Air Force Repair and Salvage Unit dispatches a team from Pell Field near Darwin to inspect the damaged Mitchell. The assessment team faces the real limit of a remote forward strip. There is no practical way to make a seriously damaged medium bomber airworthy again at Drysdale without moving major structure, tooling, parts, and men over a long, rough supply line. The salvage unit is bound by the strict constraints of forward base repair limits. Under those conditions, a heavily damaged Mitchell at a remote staging strip is not judged only by whether metal can theoretically be repaired. It is judged by transport, time, parts, manpower, and the tactical value of returning one broken airframe to service. The decision is blunt. Mississippi Dream is beyond economic repair. It is no longer a combat asset. It becomes a source of usable components. The repair unit officially declares Mississippi Dream beyond economic repair. The administrative paperwork finalizes the bomber's fate, officially striking it off charge on January 14, 1944. This decision immediately changes the operational handling procedure. The priority shifts from aircraft recovery to systematic component extraction. Military mechanics descend on the crippled bomber to harvest whatever can keep other aircraft useful. Later accounts state that engines, instruments, and other useful parts were removed and trucked out of Drysdale. The exact wartime inventory is not preserved in the public summaries, so the safe image is not a perfectly cataloged teardown of every radio, weapon, and instrument. It is a practical forward base conversion to components. Valuable items come off, the dead airframe loses its military purpose, and what remains is a battered aluminum hulk. Once the salvage unit finishes the extraction phase, the skeletal remains become dead weight beside an active forward strip. A broken hulk cannot remain where aircraft, vehicles, and ground crews still need clear working space. What remains is pushed off the operational area into the weeds, low trees, and scrub just off the runway. The bomber is no longer being recovered, it is being cleared out of the way. The operational timeline of the bomber concludes the moment it is pushed into the brush. The military abandons the site entirely, leaving the remaining strip structure exposed to the harsh Kimberley environment. The official engineering record closes on the crash, but a new, unmonitored forensic timeline immediately begins. The wreckage transitions from an active military logistical problem into a static debris field left to face an entirely different set of destructive forces. What remains of a stripped airframe after the military abandons it to the hostile Australian outback? 74 years of continuous environmental exposure fundamentally alters the physical properties of aviation-grade aluminum. When the military pushed the stripped bomber into the Kimberley scrub, it transitioned from a rigid combat asset into a static debris field. Left behind after the operational write-off decision, the hollowed airframe was immediately subjected to one of the most abrasive climates on the continent. The passage of time in this region is measured not just in years, but in severe thermal cycles and seasonal extremes. One clearly documented destructive force is outback scrub fire. Later photographs identify scrub fire damage on the nose section, and the Kimberley wet-dry cycle could leave heavy grass and scrub near the airfield before the dry season turns it combustible. The record does not prove a precise number of fires, or that each fire wrapped the whole wreck. What it does prove is simpler. Fire became part of the airframe's post-war damage history. The B-25 fuselage used heat-treated aluminum alloy, often described generically as duralumin. In factory service, that material depended on controlled heat treatment and temper for much of its strength. Fire exposure could overage, soften, distort, or otherwise weaken sections of the alloy, especially where thin skin and light frames were already cut, bent, or corroded. But without a metallurgical report from Mississippi Dream, the safest conclusion is not that every panel became uniformly dead soft or glass brittle. The safer conclusion is that heat damage added another severe weakness to a structure already broken, stripped, and exposed for decades. Over 7 decades, heat damage, rain, dirt, corrosion, scavenging, and ordinary exposure compound one another. The Kimberley climate brings a hard wet season and a long dry season, so open structure can collect moisture, ash, soil, and organic debris before drying again. Those conditions are hostile to historic aluminum alloys, especially where protective coatings have failed. The result visible in later accounts is not a continuous bomber tube, but scattered, chopped-up remains. Cockpit, mid-fuselage, rear fuselage, wing pieces, and other broken sections spread around the Drysdale site. This structural reality defines the practical limit of the site. The aircraft is no longer a coherent flying machine. It is a collection of fragile components whose value lies in the evidence still carried by the metal, not in any assumption that the fuselage can safely take normal aircraft loads again. Any recovery force has to be conservative, widely supported, and reversible, because concentrated loads could tear away damaged skin, frames, or fittings. Even in that condition, the wreck can still answer a more important historical question. What evidence survived in the warped aluminum? A standard mass-produced bomber still carries production clues in its surviving metal, and the fragmented remains of USAAF Serial 41-30816 preserve clues that narrow its wartime configuration. The evidence is not impossible hardware. It is a rare survival of early B-25D features, later field modifications, and markings that connect the wreck to a very specific NEIAF aircraft. This site analysis relies on configuration fingerprinting. This procedural method uses physical anomalies such as abandoned factory features or unauthorized field modifications to lock a specific aircraft to a very narrow operational window. Official military paperwork often lags behind rapid battlefield adaptations or fails to record exactly when a production change reaches a remote forward base. Therefore, the historical record must be verified by the metal itself. The rear fuselage chunk holds the clearest early feature. Built into the lower fuselage is the mounting position for the retractable, remotely operated ventral turret fitted to early Mitchells. The system proved ineffective in combat and disappeared from later B-25 variants, which makes the surviving fitting unusually valuable on a recovered airframe. When the wartime salvage crew stripped useful components from Mississippi Dream, the turret equipment itself was gone, but the fuselage fitting remained. That survival matters because it fixes the wreck in the early Mitchell design sequence without claiming that the part should never have existed on this airframe. Moving to the forward fuselage section reveals a second critical piece of physical evidence that complements the first. As combat operations in the Pacific Theater evolved, Allied aircrews realized the twin-engine bomber required devastating forward firepower for low-level strafing runs against shipping and ground targets. Factory-standardized exterior side blisters were eventually designed to solve this problem. But this airframe predates that engineering solution. A forensic inspection of the damaged nose skin reveals the evidence of forward-firing gun packs. Later recovery photographs show ammunition feed chute openings cut somewhat crudely into the fuselage, along with Zeus fastener holes for the gun pack fairings. That is enough to identify a field or modification center solution for forward firepower, without inventing unverified steel brackets, longeron attachments, or a measurable stress footprint in the ribs. The combination of a rare early factory feature in the rear and forward firing gun pack evidence in the front makes the surviving metal a highly unusual historical document. Those structural fingerprints support the aircraft's early war configuration, while the serial record N5-161 identity, radio call placard, and faint oxidized nose markings tie the wreck to Mississippi Dream. It is not just another broken bomber, but a physical timeline of rapid wartime adaptation inside 18 Squadron. The forensic value of these surviving features helps explain why a museum recovery effort was worth attempting. Identifying rare hardware is one thing, but how does an expedition safely extract such fragile evidence from the dirt? Lifting a heavily compromised airframe forces a severe procedural trade-off. Applying mechanical force to salvage the remaining evidence simultaneously risks accelerating its total structural collapse. The objective is strictly preservation, but the very act of removal introduces violent kinetic energy to a dead soft aluminum shell. In 1981, an initial attempt to extract the forward nose section shows how quickly a remote recovery can fail. Aviation archaeologist Stan Gaida secured permission to recover the battered nose for a museum display. With no lifting equipment at the mission, local helpers used 44-gallon drums and trestles to raise the section so a semi-trailer could back underneath it. The plan collapsed when the truck operator reneged on the handshake transport agreement and drove back to Derby. The nose was left on its platform. Gaida later heard it fell in a storm and ended up near the airfield perimeter fence. The failed 1981 extraction proves a narrower but important point. In country that remote, transport arrangements can decide whether a recovery succeeds at all. In late 2017, the Reevers Warbirds effort recovers the remaining footprint. Public accounts describe substantial, badly chopped up remains, not a complete airframe. That distinction matters. The recovery problem is not how to fly the bomber again. It is how to lift and move fragile cockpit, fuselage, wing, and rear sections without losing the historical evidence still attached to them. Photographs show the remains being loaded at Drysdale River and later unloaded at Airfield. So the safe statement is that each section had to be supported carefully as an irregular historic load rather than handled like an intact aircraft. Once positioned for transport, the sections have to be restrained without treating the thin skin as a primary structure. The public record does not document exact strap routes, clamping calculations, or pallet contact points, so those details should remain generalized. The key procedural truth is simpler. The load must be secured against shifting while avoiding unnecessary compression of fragile, weathered structure. The team completes the extraction because the remains arrive at Airfield still recognizable as major sections of Mississippi Dream. The loaded pallets are subsequently positioned onto heavy flatbed trailers. The recovery team effectively transfers the disjointed outback debris field directly onto a mobile platform. The initial lifting constraint is solved, but the hardest operational phase immediately begins. Once lifted and placed onto pallets, how does a team move fire-damaged scrap across a continent without it shattering? Securing awkward, damaged fuselage sections to long-haul transport immediately introduces a dynamic loading problem. The static preservation achieved during the initial lift is only temporary. The destination is an aviation preservation facility at Airfield Airport near Adelaide, South Australia, roughly 2,000 miles from Drysdale River. Public photographs show the wreckage riding on a massive multi-trailer truck, but the available sources do not identify a specific road train suspension design or prove that it was mechanically mismatched to the load. The safer point is that the aircraft sections had to survive a very long overland journey while being protected from vibration, movement, weather, and handling damage. That long haul forces a real engineering constraint, but the surviving public accounts do not document the exact mitigation system. They do not confirm rubber matting, dense damping layers, calculated convoy speeds, chain logic, or structured inspection intervals. Those measures may be plausible, but they should not be narrated as established fact without the recovery team's own procedure notes. What can be verified is that the scattered remains were trucked from remote northern Western Australia to Airfield, and that the major sections were photographed after arrival. The question, then, is not whether a specific, unverified damping plan worked. The question is simpler and stronger. Did the fragile historical footprint survive the journey south? We can physically verify the successful relocation of a highly fragmented early war bomber, but the condition of the wreckage restricts what can responsibly be claimed about its future. What has been gained is a rare physical record of remote forward base operations. The heavy overland transport reaches Airfield Airport near Adelaide, bringing the extraction phase to a close. Public photographs show the cockpit, fuselage, wing remains, and mid-rear fuselage being unloaded and moved into the hangar. The wreckage of the North American B-25D Mitchell is finally under cover. The immediate priority shifts from movement to assessment and display planning. Reevers accounts reported an intention to show the aircraft in as found condition, with discussion of repairing the cockpit section for a static display. That is different from proving a climate-controlled conservation laboratory, a completed non-invasive cleaning protocol, or a fully mapped structural survey. Inside the hangar, the wreck is protected from the elements and scrappers, but any detailed conservation procedure should be stated only when documented by the custodians. This cautious-as-found approach protects the core historical asset. The broken sections of USAAF Serial 41-30816 serve as a rare, tangible anchor for 18 Squadron. This unit represented a distinctive joint operational effort integrating Netherlands East Indies Air Force personnel with Australian support and command structures while operating from remote northern bases. The physical airframe documents that reality better as evidence than as a fantasy of immediate full restoration. The crude gunpack openings, the rare ventral turret fitting, and the surviving traces of identity are not flaws to erase. They are the signatures that justify the recovery effort. By getting the fragments under cover and preserving them in as found condition, the recovery team closes the gap that began when the military first abandoned the aircraft. The historical footprint of Mississippi Dream is finally secure enough to ask the next careful question: can the salvage cockpit section support a static nose profile without destroying the evidence it carries?